Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Herbert Hoover, and the focus is from the cabinet to the White House. The year is 1921, and Hoover is now the Secretary of Commerce, and he is a very active, almost aggressive Secretary of Commerce, sometimes moving in other directions, like in other people's turf, but he felt he always had the backing of the President Warren Harding. According to Hoover, Harding encouraged me in everything I wanted to do. I never knew him to give a promise he did not keep. Now, foremost in the minds of the Harding administration at the beginning of their term was a recession. In the post-war environment, the economy was kind of out of balance. Supply and demand and unemployment had spiked to over 12%. This was their first topic of real importance, and the Hardings decided to call a national conference on unemployment. He welcomed people to Washington for this. He gave the introductory remarks, but he then turned things over to Herbert Hoover, who really facilitated this event. Now, the Harding and Hoover were both aligned with the American tradition of not giving handouts from the federal government, even when times were tough. That just wasn't the American way. That didn't mean, though, that the federal government was just going to sit there on its hands and do nothing. And Hoover believed the best thing they could do was to accelerate public works. Federal government, state, municipalities, if they would accelerate construction projects, that would put people to work. It would be productive. It would actually give the community things that would give them benefits over time. And this is what a lot of them did, and it worked. That and the natural economic cycle, unemployment was cut in half by the following year. The following year after that, it dropped below 5%. It stayed below 5% throughout the entire decade of the 1920s, right until the last few weeks of the 20s, and that's when Herbert Hoover was president. We'll talk about that in a future episode. Now, for the Secretary of Commerce, one of his core focus areas was standards at the Commerce Department. All manner of new inventions were coming along in the 1920s, electronics, individual commercial supplies, but there weren't a lot of standards, and for Hoover, the great engineer, this was leading to a lot of inefficiency. According to Hoover, the man who has a standard electric light, a standard radio, and 1.5 hours more daily leisure is more of a man and has more individuality than he has without these tools for varying his life. He also believed that standards should not be imposed by the federal government. Again, what's that role of the federal government versus the states? But he did believe there was a role that the federal government can play to facilitate standards. So he called conferences. One after another, industry leaders were invited to come to Washington, and they collaboratively worked out new standards for all kinds of things, from milk bottles to concrete blocks to rail joints to automobile brakes to elevators, and on and on and on. A lot of positive impact for the American economy. Now, like I said, there were turf battles for Hoover at times, particularly with the Agriculture Secretary, Henry Wallace, and also at one point with Harding's Attorney General, Harry Doherty, very close to Harding personally. But he had gone to court to get a very wide-sweeping injunction against striking railway workers that Herbert Hoover thought just went way too far, almost, again, un-American, and he told Doherty. He said he was outraged by its obvious transgression of the most rudimentary rights of man. One thing about Herbert Hoover, never shy about stating his opinion. July now of 1923, and President Harding, everybody's taking a break. Congress has gone into recess, and Harding decides to head west. He's going to be the first president to travel to the territory of Alaska. He brings 3 cabinet secretaries with him, including Herbert Hoover. And this is supposed to be all about rest. And while Harding and the party did have plenty of time to meet the locals and do a lot of sightseeing, he was also inundated with constant speeches. And by the time they got back to the state of Washington, Harding was exhausted. In fact, he was physically unwell. Hoover was among those that were worried about the president. They said, we have to shut down this tour. Let's get the president to San Francisco by train as fast as we can. We'll put him up at the Palace Hotel, and hopefully he'll get to some rest and recover. He did not recover. August 2nd of 1923, Warren Harding died. That night, Calvin Coolidge was sworn in as the 30th President of the United States, all across the country on his father's farm in Plymouth Notch, Vermont. Now, Hoover and Coolidge had certainly known each other for quite some time. They were not exactly close. Not many people were that close with Coolidge. His sort of natural taciturnity made it difficult to get to know Coolidge, but Coolidge did lean pretty heavily on Hoover as one of his key cabinet members for the next 5.5 years, because Coolidge, after he wins his own term in 1924, president those 5.5 years with Hoover as one of his key secretaries in the cabinet, continued to expand his domain, more conferences in more areas. areas. Take radio, for example, exploding in the 1920s, but there was conflicting signals in the airways on frequencies, and so Hoover orchestrated a conference. They settled this in a voluntary fashion and had new standards that were good for the industry. Other areas, how about travel safety, the width of roads, street signs, things like that, he worked to get standards for. Stood up an aeronautics division in the Department of Commerce. Their responsibility, again, safety-related standards. The public was interested in commercial air travel, but they were also concerned about safety. And so Hoover's aeronautics division focused on safety standards. Now, Calvin Coolidge, the president, supported Hoover in most of these efforts, but there was one area they were a little bit at odds, and that was the area of water management. According to Hoover, every drop of water that runs to the sea without yielding its full commercial returns to the nation is an economic waste. Again, the great engineer doesn't like inefficiency like that, and so he wanted to greatly invest in water management, expand navigable waterways across the country, invest in building dams to generate hydroelectric power, including a massive project on the Colorado River right near Las Vegas that was going to serve potentially up to 6 states. In this area, Calvin Coolidge wasn't so sure because his policies for economics were actually very simple. Cut taxes and cut spending. And those policies helped keep the roaring 20s going, the most prosperous decade in really economic history for the United States. And he just thought this was going to be way too much money. And so for the one time, Hoover had to kind of curtail some of his enthusiasm in this area of water management, at least for now. Now, and speaking of water, the country had a lot of excess water in 1927. Unprecedented rainfall, levees were breached, massive flooding across the entire Mississippi Valley, the worst flooding in American history. According to Hoover, it was the greatest peacetime calamity in the history of the country. 25,000 square miles were flooded, destroyed a couple million acres of crops, thousands of livestock were killed, displaced over 750,000 people. Again, what's the role of the federal government? Well, traditionally in weather-related events like this, it was nothing. Federalism, you had that break between the responsibility of the federal government and the states. Typically, weather disasters like this was the responsibility of the states. There would be no handouts coming from the Calvin Coolidge administration despite this calamity, but he did have something to offer. He could offer Herbert Hoover, the man who was the master of relief. He would be the federal coordinator for this. He would work with the Red Cross. He would raise money. He would work on logistics. He would go into towns and tell people a couple of thousand refugees are coming. They've got to have accommodations, huts, water mains, sewers, streets, dining halls, meals, doctors, everything, and you haven't got months to do it in, you haven't got weeks, you've got hours, and people responded. That voluntary call to service that Hoover championed so much, for the most part, people again came through. He spent 3 months in the Mississippi Valley, set up 150 temporary camps, kind of nonstop activity, and the public face of the federal response, the coordinated response, not bad with an election year coming up. Big question in 1928 or going into 28 is, would Calvin Coolidge run for another term in office? He was in an awkward spot. The tradition for the United States, going back to the days of George Washington, is no third term. But would this be a third term for Coolidge? He would have served about 5.5 years by the end of the current term, the end of the Harding administration or Harding term, and then 1 term of his own. Most people thought this would not be violating the third term tradition and that Coolidge would not only run, he would win with the economy booming like it was. But Coolidge said no. On August the 2nd of 1927, 4 years to the day that he had risen to the office of the presidency, he was on vacation in South Dakota. He brought in the press. He had not told anybody about this, including his wife, and he made an announcement. I do not choose to run for president in 1928. He wrote that out by hand. He passed it out to the reporters, said, I have nothing else to say. People were confused by the wording here. I do not choose to run. What did that actually mean? What if others chose for you, like a draft at the convention? Would Coolidge accept that? He basically was saying, look, the statement speaks for itself. Well, what did the party do? They had to look elsewhere. And a lot of people started looking at Herbert Hoover as a potential frontrunner. Now, Herbert Hoover had never run for political office in his entire life. He'd been very public, certainly, in a number of different roles, but he'd actually never run for office. He would not campaign for the nomination. He still thought Coolidge was going to run, even though Hoover was stacking up delegates in the primary season. Eventually, he went to see the president and said, look, what should I do here with all these delegates? And Coolidge told him, I think if you have 400 delegates, you ought to keep them. And that was kind of the last barrier. Everybody, when they got together at the convention in Kansas City in 1928, it was pretty much a foregone conclusion that Herbert Hoover would be the nominee. It happened on the first ballot. It was nearly unanimous. The Senate Majority Leader, Charles Curtis of Kansas, similarly nearly unanimous, a first ballot selection. Hoover resigned his position as the Secretary of Commerce, let the fall campaign begin. That campaign would go up against the Democrat Al Smith, the former governor of New York. Politics were not that different between Smith and Hoover. Both were pretty progressive, but personality-wise, extremely different. Smith was a career politician. He was outspoken, in fact, loud at times. He liked to shake hands and kiss babies, all the traditional political things, and Herbert Hoover did virtually none of this. He was an engineer. He was analytical. He had little appetite for glad-handing and those kinds of things and small talk. He said that I've never liked the clamor of crowd. I intensely dislike superficial contacts. I made no pretensions to oratory, and I was terrorized at the opening of every speech. One of his biggest speeches was his formal acceptance of the nomination. It took place back home at the Stanford campus in the football stadium, where about 60,000 people showed up. Some 50 million more Americans were listening in on the radio. It was a policy-filled address by Hoover, which was typical for him. The triumph of the American economy in Republican hands is what he talked about. We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land. The poorhouse is vanishing from among us. We shall soon, with the help of God, be in sight of the day when poverty will be banished from this nation. Upon the structure of material progress as a base, we are erecting a structure of idealism that would be impossible without the material foundation. The American people had no reason for change. Peace was in the world, the economy was booming, and Herbert Hoover moved out to a landslide victory. He beat Smith in the Electoral College 444 to 87. It was a record 21 million people voted for Herbert Hoover. In the 1928 election, he captured 58% of the vote. Hoover himself, he was humbled by the overwhelming support of the American people. And he said, in this hour, there can be no feeling for me of victory or exultation. Rather, it imposes a sense of solemn responsibility of the future and complete dependence upon divine guidance. For Herbert Hoover, the great engineer and the great humanitarian, he was now the president-elect of the United States. That is Herbert Hoover. From the cabinet to the White House, from the life of Herbert Hoover. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.